It all started on a Friday night. Ryan and I were hanging out at our favorite bar, the Rusty Nail. It's this old, run-down place, but it's got character. We loved it because it wasn't too crowded and the beer was cheap. That night we were in high spirits. We had just finished a grueling week at work, and we were looking forward to our weekend camping trip. "Man, I can't wait to get out into the woods," Ryan said, clinking his bottle against mine. "It's gonna be epic." "Yeah, just us and nature. No phones, no work, no worries," I replied. We were both outdoor enthusiasts, and camping was our way to unwind. We spent the night talking about the trip. We planned to leave early in the morning, head to Pine Ridge Forest, and spend the weekend hiking, fishing, and just relaxing by the campfire. Pine Ridge was a few hours away, but it was worth the drive. The forest was dense and secluded, perfect for getting away from it all. As the night went on, we had a few more beers and some laughs. The bar was dimly lit, with old neon signs flickering in the background. The smell of fried food hung in the air. It was our kind of place, where everyone knew each other, and the bartender, Mike, was like a friend. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. "See you at 5, dude. Don't be late," Ryan said as we walked out to our cars. "Wouldn't dream of it," I replied, giving him a mock salute. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my alarm blaring at 4:30 a.m. I quickly got dressed, grabbed my gear, and headed out. Ryan was already waiting for me in his truck when I pulled into his driveway. "Ready to roll?" he asked, looking far too awake for the early hour. "Ready," I said, throwing my backpack in the back and hopping into the passenger seat. The drive to Pine Ridge was uneventful. We blasted some classic rock, talked about work, and made plans for what we'd do once we got to the campsite. The road was long and winding, cutting through miles of dense forest. It was still early morning, and the sun was just starting to peek over the horizon, casting long shadows across the road. When we finally arrived, we parked the truck at the edge of the forest. The air was crisp and cool, and the smell of pine was strong. We grabbed our packs and headed down the trail, laughing and joking as we went. It was about a 2-mile hike to our favorite spot, a clearing by a small, clear stream. We set up camp quickly. Ryan was always better at pitching the tent than I was, so I gathered firewood while he handled that. By the time we were done, the sun was high in the sky. We spent the day hiking, fishing, and just enjoying the peace and quiet of the forest. It was perfect. That evening, we sat around the campfire, cooking the fish we'd caught and sharing stories. The fire crackled, sending sparks up into the darkening sky. The sounds of the forest surrounded us, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the chirping of crickets. "This is the life," Ryan said, leaning back in his camping chair. "Just us and the wilderness." "Couldn't agree more," I replied, taking a sip of my beer. We talked late into the night, the fire slowly dying down to glowing embers. Eventually, we decided to call it a night and crawled into our tent. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when I woke up to a sound outside the tent. It was faint, like someone walking through the underbrush. I figured it was just an animal and tried to go back to sleep, but then I heard it again, closer this time. "Ryan, you hear that?" I whispered. "Hear what?" he mumbled, half asleep. "That noise outside." He sat up, listening. We both heard it then, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving around our campsite. "Probably just a deer or something," Ryan said, but he didn't sound convinced. We waited, listening. The footsteps stopped, and everything went silent. After a few minutes, we decided it was nothing and tried to go back to sleep. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us. The next morning, we woke up early and decided to do some more hiking. We packed a small bag with water and snacks and set off down a different trail. The forest was beautiful, the sunlight filtering through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground. After a couple of hours, we found a small, secluded lake. It was perfect. We spent the day there, swimming and lounging by the water. It felt like we were the only two people in the world. As the sun began to set, we headed back to our campsite. When we got there, something felt off. The campsite looked exactly as we'd left it, but there was an uneasy feeling in the air. "You feel that?" I asked Ryan. "Yeah, it's like, I don't know, like someone's been here." We checked our gear, but nothing was missing. Still, the feeling of being watched was back. We decided to make a bigger fire that night, hoping it would keep any animals or anything else away. As we sat around the fire, the feeling of unease grew. The forest seemed darker, the shadows longer. We tried to shake it off, telling ourselves we were just being paranoid. At some point, we heard the footsteps again. This time, they were unmistakable. Slow, deliberate steps, circling our campsite. "Who's there?" Ryan called out, standing up. There was no answer. The footsteps stopped. We stood there, staring into the darkness, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, we convinced ourselves it was just an animal again and went back to the fire. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest. Sometime after midnight, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were right outside the tent. I nudged Ryan. "Ryan, wake up." He sat up, groggy. "What is it?" "The footsteps. They're back." We listened, and sure enough, we heard them. Slow, heavy steps, just outside the tent. We grabbed our flashlights and unzipped the tent, shining the lights into the darkness. There was nothing there. We stepped out, looking around. The forest was silent. Then we saw it. Footprints, large and deep, leading away from our campsite. "Let's follow them," Ryan said. "Are you crazy? What if it's a bear or something?" I replied. "Bears don't walk on two legs," he pointed out. He was right. The footprints were human. We followed the footprints for about 100 yards, deeper into the forest. Then they just stopped. It was like whoever or whatever had made them had vanished into thin air. "This is messed up," I said, feeling a chill run down my spine. "Let's just go back to camp," Ryan suggested, and I was more than happy to agree. The next day, we decided to cut our trip short. We packed up our gear and hiked back to the truck. The whole way, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. When we got back to town, we went straight to the police. We told them everything: the footsteps, the feeling of being watched, the footprints. They took our statement and said they'd look into it. A few days later, I got a call from the police. They wanted me to come down to the station. When I got there, they told me they'd found something. They'd gone out to our campsite and found more footprints, leading away from where we'd stopped. They followed them and found a small, hidden cabin in the woods. Inside, they found evidence: clothing, personal items, and a journal. The journal belonged to Ryan. It detailed everything: our camping trips, our conversations, even my fears and anxieties. But it also had something else: plans to scare me, to make me paranoid, to isolate me. And then, the last entry: "Josh will never see it coming. Tomorrow it ends." I couldn't believe it. My best friend, the guy I'd known since childhood, had planned to kill me. The police said they believed Ryan had been suffering from some sort of mental illness, but I couldn't understand it. How could I have missed the signs? Ryan was arrested and charged with attempted murder. He's in a mental institution now, getting the help he needs. But I'll never forget that camping trip and the realization that the real danger had been right beside me the whole time. It happened when I went camping with my two best friends, Jake and Tom. It's been a few years, but I still can't shake the memories. If you're into scary stories, buckle up, because this one is real. So it all started on a Friday afternoon. We decided to go camping in this remote forest a few hours' drive from our town. We'd been there once before, and it was awesome. No cell service, just us and nature. Perfect getaway, right? Anyway, we packed up our gear, loaded it into Jake's beat-up old Jeep, and hit the road. We were excited. It was going to be a weekend of fishing, hiking, and chilling by the campfire. We got to the campsite just as the sun was setting. The place was exactly how we remembered it: a clearing in the woods with a fire pit in the middle. We set up our tents, got a fire going, and just enjoyed the evening. We talked, joked around, and shared a few beers. Life was good. As the night wore on, the fire started to die down, and the forest around us got eerily quiet. We were in the middle of nowhere, so no surprise there. We decided to call it a night. I remember the stars were incredibly bright that night, and the air was crisp. It was the perfect night for camping. I don't know what time it was, but I woke up to the sound of something moving outside my tent. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but then I heard this low, grumbling noise, like someone breathing heavily. My heart started racing. I poked my head out of the tent, and that's when I saw him. There, at the edge of our campsite, stood this huge guy. He was really tall and built like a tank. He was wearing this messed up, blood-stained outfit, and the worst part, he had this grotesque mask made out of human skin covering his face. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was like something out of a nightmare. I froze. I couldn't move or make a sound. Then he started walking towards us. That's when I snapped out of it and screamed. I yelled for Jake and Tom to wake up. They scrambled out of their tents, and we all just stood there, staring at this monster coming closer. He didn't say anything. He just raised this massive chainsaw and revved it up. The sound was deafening. We freaked out and ran in different directions. I bolted into the woods, not caring where I was going. I just knew I had to get away from that maniac. As I was running, I heard the chainsaw roaring and the sound of trees being cut down. It felt like he was right behind me. I stumbled and fell a couple of times, but I kept going. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually the noise faded away. I stopped to catch my breath and tried to listen for any signs of Jake or Tom. Nothing. Just the sound of my own ragged breathing and the distant hum of the forest. I wandered around for what felt like hours, calling out for my friends. Eventually, I found Jake. He was hiding behind a fallen tree, looking as terrified as I felt. We hugged each other, glad to be alive, but there was no sign of Tom. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, too scared to move. As the first light of dawn broke, we cautiously made our way back to the campsite. It was a mess. Our tents were slashed to pieces, and there were deep gouges in the ground where the chainsaw had been. And then we saw Tom, or what was left of him. He was lying near the fire pit, covered in blood. His face, God, it was gone. The skin had been ripped off. I puked right then and there. Jake was sobbing uncontrollably. We were in shock. We stumbled out of the woods and found a park ranger. He called the cops, and they launched a massive search, but they never found the guy. He just vanished. They said it was probably some psycho who'd been living off the grid. Whatever. All I know is that he's still out there. Jake and I haven't really talked about that night since. We drifted apart after that. I guess we both deal with it in our own ways. I still can't go into the woods without getting paranoid. And I can't unsee that mask or what he did to Tom. So, this happened last summer. I had just broken up with my girlfriend and needed some time alone to clear my head. I've always loved camping, and the thought of getting away from everything sounded perfect. I packed up my gear and headed out to a remote spot in the forest. I had been there once before with some friends, but this time I was going alone. The drive was uneventful, just hours of winding roads and the occasional gas station. I got to the trailhead in the early afternoon. It was a perfect day for hiking, sunny but not too hot. I strapped on my backpack, locked my car, and started the hike. The plan was to camp near a small lake I knew about 10 miles in. I figured it would take me about 3 hours to get there. The hike was peaceful. I saw a few deer, some birds, the usual stuff. I was making good time and feeling pretty good about my decision to get away. I reached the lake just as the sun was starting to set. The light was perfect, reflecting off the water like a painting. I found a good spot to set up my tent, right near the shore. I made camp, started a small fire, and cooked some dinner. By the time I finished eating, it was dark. That's when things started to get weird. As I was cleaning up, I heard something moving in the bushes behind me. I figured it was just a deer or something, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned around a few times, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever it was, but I didn't see anything. The fire was crackling, the lake was calm, and the forest was quiet. Too quiet. I shrugged it off and decided to go to bed early. I crawled into my tent and zipped it up, leaving the fire to die down on its own. I lay there for a while, just listening to the sounds of the forest. I could hear the occasional rustle of leaves, but nothing out of the ordinary. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me up. I lay there, my heart pounding, listening. That's when I heard it, a soft, whispering sound, like someone was talking just outside my tent. I couldn't make out any words, just a low, hushed murmuring. I held my breath, straining to hear. The whispering stopped, and for a moment there was complete silence. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate steps, moving around my tent. I froze, my mind racing. Who the hell would be out here in the middle of the night, and why were they walking around my tent? The footsteps circled my tent a few times, then stopped. I lay there, not daring to move. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat echoing in the silence. Minutes passed, and still, I heard nothing. Just as I was starting to think maybe it was an animal, the whispering started again, closer this time. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed with fear. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. It felt like it was right next to me, just on the other side of the thin tent fabric. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, every muscle in my body tense. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. I lay there for what felt like hours, too afraid to move, too afraid to breathe. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off into a fitful sleep. When I woke up, it was morning. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and everything looked normal. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined the whole thing, but when I crawled out of my tent, I saw them. Footprints, clear as day, circling my tent. They weren't animal tracks, they were human. My heart started racing again. I quickly packed up my camp, not even bothering to eat breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. As I hiked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. I was on high alert, my senses tingling. When I finally reached my car, I almost cried with relief. I tossed my gear in the back seat and jumped in, locking the doors behind me. The drive home was a blur. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. I don't know who or what was out there that night, and I'm not sure I want to know. I haven't been camping since, and I don't think I ever will again. The thought of being out there, alone, with whatever that was, is too much. I've told a few friends about what happened, but I don't think they really believe me. They think I'm exaggerating or that it was just my imagination. But I know what I heard, and I know what I saw. Those footprints were real.